Aeronautical technology was advancing so rapidly in those years that a revolutionary design could become scrap metal in less than a decade. The MiG-19, the first Soviet supersonic fighter, was already showing serious limitations when faced with new Western developments. Engineers at the McCoy-Gurevich Design Bureau knew they needed something radically different, something that could compete directly with the best American fighters and remain relevant for years. The result was an aircraft that defied all expectations. The MiG-21 combined the characteristics of a fighter-bomber and an interceptor into a single compact and lethal design. Its most distinctive feature was its triangular delta wings, which allowed it to reach Mach 2 speeds with a relatively modest turbojet engine. But the real revolution came when China delivered an unexpected gift to the Soviet Union, an American AIM-9 Sidewinder missile captured in combat against Taiwan. Soviet engineers dismantled the weapon piece by piece, studied every component, and created their own version, the K-13, an infrared-guided missile that entered service in 1960 as the standard armament of the MiG-21. Production of the Soviet fighter began in 1959, 3 years after its successful maiden flight. Unlike large American fighters packed with complex systems, the MiG-21 was small, built with traditional materials, and designed for simple manufacturing. This meant it could be produced faster, cheaper, and in massive numbers. More importantly, any mechanic with basic training could keep it operational, an essential advantage for countries with limited infrastructure. Simplicity did not mean weakness, but deadly efficiency. The aircraft could carry up to 4,500 pounds of weapons in a single mission, including air-to-air guided missiles, unguided bombs, and devastating rockets. By April 1966, a Soviet cargo ship secretly docked at the port of Da Nang, carrying in its holds the first batch of MiG-21s destined for the Vietnam People's Air Force. Pilots of the 921st Fighter Regiment, the country's most veteran unit, received these aircraft with a mix of excitement and nervousness. They knew they would face the best-trained American pilots in the world, flying machines that cost millions of dollars and were equipped with the most advanced radars of the era. Yet the Vietnamese possessed something no sophisticated equipment could match: absolute determination and completely unexpected tactics. The MiG-21 had an operational range of just 720 miles, a limitation Western strategists considered a critical weakness. American aircraft were designed for long, autonomous missions, with pilots making independent decisions based on onboard radar. But the Soviets and Vietnamese turned this apparent disadvantage into their greatest strength. They designed short, brutally effective interception missions, controlled entirely from the ground. Operators in underground bunkers tracked every movement of American formations by radar, guiding the MiGs directly to their targets without the need for heavy and complex onboard equipment. It was a completely different philosophy of aerial warfare. On July 7, 1966, just 3 months after receiving their new fighters, pilots Tran Van Minh and his wingman Le Duc Tan took off on an interception mission over Kep Air Base. Ground controllers informed them that a formation of F-105 Thunder Chiefs was approaching to bomb military installations. These American supersonic bombers were imposing machines, designed to penetrate enemy defenses at high speed and deliver tons of explosives. The American pilots trusted their speed and firepower, never imagining that 2 slender Vietnamese fighters were stalking them from higher altitude. Minh and Tan executed a coordinated attack from opposite angles, completely confusing the American pilots. Minh fired an unguided S-5 rocket that tore through the air and struck one of the Thunder Chiefs directly, ripping off its wing and sending it plunging into the jungle. The rest of the American formation immediately broke apart, jettisoning their bombs prematurely to gain speed and escape. The 2 MiGs did not pursue the fleeing bombers. Instead, they broke hard and returned to base before American escort fighters could intervene. It was the MiG-21's first blood in Vietnam, but it would certainly not be the last. The Vietnamese quickly perfected a tactic Americans would desperately come to call air guerrilla warfare. MiGs attacked simultaneously from multiple directions, forcing bomber formations to scatter and abandon their objectives. They struck fast, shot down 1 or 2 aircraft, and vanished before the Americans could organize an effective response. They sought no prolonged battles or heroic dogfights. Their goal was to inflict losses, sow fear, and return home. By December of that same year, pilots of the 921st Regiment had destroyed 14 F-105 Thunder Chiefs without suffering a single loss, statistics that deeply humiliated the United States Air Force. The situation worsened dramatically when F-4 Phantoms, the pride of American aviation, began falling as well. These all-weather interceptors were designed to dominate any air battle, equipped with advanced missiles and enormously expensive electronic systems. Yet the lightweight MiG-21 outmaneuvered them, and Vietnamese pilots exploited every weakness. Between May and December 1966, the Americans lost 47 aircraft while destroying only 12 North Vietnamese fighters. The ratio was unsustainable and politically catastrophic. In Washington, furious generals demanded an immediate solution. Pentagon operations wings became arenas of heated debate during the autumn of 1966. Maps of North Vietnam were covered with small red flags marking the airfields from which MiG-21s were launching to tear apart American bombing formations. The solution seemed obvious: send waves of bombers and crater those runways into useless wreckage. But political rules of engagement strictly forbade it. Soviet and Chinese advisors were working at those bases, and Washington feared that attacking them could escalate the conflict into a direct confrontation with Moscow or Beijing. American pilots had to face the MiGs in the air, or not face them at all. The 7th Air Force, directing operations from Laos, reached a breaking point. In nearly 2 years of intense aerial combat, they had managed to shoot down fewer than 30 North Vietnamese fighters, a pathetic number compared to their own losses. The MiG-21s seemed like metallic ghosts, appearing from nowhere, striking with surgical precision, and vanishing before anyone could react. American pilots returned to their bases in Laos with stories of frustrating encounters in which the small Soviet fighters outperformed them in climb rate and turning ability. Morale was plummeting, and commanders desperately needed a decisive victory to prove that American technology could defeat these seemingly invincible adversaries. That was when they selected Colonel James Bradley to carry out what was initially called a special mission. Bradley was a living legend of combat aviation. He had shot down enemy aircraft in World War II and now commanded a tactical fighter wing stationed in Laos. He possessed an aggressive instinct and a strategic mind, exactly the kind of man needed to design an aerial ambush requiring both audacity and pinpoint precision. For weeks, Bradley and his team studied every MiG flight pattern, every American bombing route, every radio frequency used by the North Vietnamese. They searched for the perfect moment and the perfect trap. The plan that emerged was brilliantly simple. F-4 Phantoms would fly the exact same routes normally used by the heavy F-105 Thunder Chiefs during Operation Rolling Thunder bombing missions. They would maintain the same altitudes, the same cruise speeds, the same formations. From the ground, Vietnamese radar operators would see exactly what they expected: another wave of slow, vulnerable bombers approaching their targets. Ground controllers would order their MiG-21s to take off and intercept what they believed to be easy prey. But when the Vietnamese fighters arrived to attack, they would discover too late that they had bitten a deadly hook. They would not be facing clumsy bombers, but agile F-4 fighters, armed to the teeth and hungry for revenge. However, there was a secret element of Operation Bolo that would not be revealed until decades later, after the Cold War ended and military documents were declassified. C-130B-2 spy aircraft equipped with signal interception systems would fly near the combat zone, listening to every radio transmission between Vietnamese ground controllers and MiG pilots. This electronic intelligence would be transmitted in real time to the F-4 Phantoms, allowing them to know exactly when enemy fighters took off, how many were approaching, and from which directions they would attack. Bradley insisted on this component. He wanted his strike force to receive instant warnings if anything went wrong, allowing them to abort the mission and return safely if the Vietnamese detected the deception. The date was set for January 2, 1967. The pilots selected for the operation underwent intensive briefing sessions, reviewing every detail until it was memorized. They practiced bomber formations again and again, ensuring their F-4 4 Phantoms flew exactly like the Thunder Chiefs the Vietnamese expected to hunt. They reviewed close-in air combat procedures, missile tactics, and escape maneuvers. They knew they would face experienced Vietnamese pilots flying fast, lethal machines, but they also knew they held the advantage of absolute surprise. And in aerial combat, surprise was worth more than any technological superiority. The early morning of January 2, 1967, dawned with low clouds over the air bases in Laos. American pilots gathered in briefing rooms to hear final instructions before taking off on what many considered either a suicide mission or the ultimate masterstroke. James Bradley looked at his men and spoke simply. They would fly like the slowest, most predictable bombers in the sky, and when the MiGs bit the bait, they would show them what it meant to fall into a trap set by professional hunters. Engines roared, wheels left the tarmac, and dozens of F-4 Phantoms rose in perfectly calculated formations that exactly mimicked routine bombing patterns. Over North Vietnam, radar operators in underground bunkers detected the American formations approaching along familiar routes. Ground controllers smiled with satisfaction. Another chance to hunt American bombers before they could release their weapons. Orders flowed through military radios to the pilots of the 921st Regiment. MiG-21s began taxiing down runways, engines reaching full power as they took off in pairs toward what they anticipated would be another easy victory against clumsy American attack formations. C-130B spy aircraft immediately intercepted these communications and transmitted the critical information. Enemies in the air approaching from the northwest, estimated altitude 6,000 meters. The first MiGs to reach the interception zone executed their standard approach maneuver, climbing to dive down on what they believed were bomb-laden F-105 Thunder Chiefs. But when they closed in close enough to visually identify their targets, horror struck like a hammer. They were not heavy bombers, but F-4 Phantoms in air-to-air combat configuration, turning aggressively toward them with missiles already armed. One Vietnamese pilot tried to warn his comrades over the radio, but it was too late. The Americans had already launched their first radar-guided AM-7 Sparrow missiles. Chaos erupted within seconds. One MiG-21 exploded into an orange fireball as an American missile tore through its slender fuselage. Another attempted a desperate evasive maneuver, banking sharply left, but a second F-4 had already locked on and fired an AM-9 Sidewinder, which homed in on the heat of its engine and struck directly. The pilot managed to eject, his parachute deploying as the smoking wreckage of his aircraft fell into the jungle. It was Pham Ton Nhan, a pilot who would survive this humiliating shoot-down and return angrily to the skies, eventually scoring 9 more victories and becoming one of North Vietnam's most feared aces. The remaining MiGs tried to scatter, desperately seeking escape from the deadly trap. Some turned violently toward the low clouds hoping to hide, but American radars tracked them relentlessly. Others attempted to use their superior climb rate to gain altitude and disengage, only to discover that the F-4s had anticipated this tactic and were already blocking their escape routes. In less than 12 minutes of frantic combat, 7 MiG-21s had been destroyed, their wreckage scattered across dozens of square kilometers of Vietnamese territory. Not a single F-4 Phantom suffered significant damage. It was the most devastating loss ratio the North Vietnamese had experienced since receiving their first Soviet fighters. Pentagon analysts quickly calculated the strategic implications. They estimated that Hanoi possessed between 20 and 25 operational MiG-21s before Operation Bolo. Losing 7 in a single day meant roughly 35% of their entire interceptor force had been eliminated in mere minutes. For North Vietnamese commanders, it was an absolute disaster that exposed the fundamental vulnerability of their tactics. They depended entirely on ground control and surprise, and when both disappeared, their pilots were dangerously exposed against better-trained and better-equipped adversaries. The Vietnamese response was immediate and drastic. All MiG-21 operations were suspended indefinitely, while Hanoi's military strategists completely re-evaluated their air combat doctrine. Bases became centers of intense analysis, where Soviet and Vietnamese officers studied radio recordings, debated new tactics, and redesigned operational procedures. MiGs remained grounded for weeks, an absence American pilots noticed immediately and celebrated as proof they had finally broken the myth of Soviet fighter invincibility. After the humiliation of Operation Bolo, MiG-21s eventually returned to combat with modified tactics, but they never regained the aura of invincibility that had surrounded them during the early months in Vietnam. North Vietnamese pilots learned to be more cautious, to verify the true identity of their targets 2 and 3 times before committing to attack, and to always maintain escape routes. Yet the psychological damage was done. Both sides knew these Soviet fighters could be deceived and destroyed en masse if the right strategy was applied. The air war continued for years, but it never again tilted so dramatically in favor of either side. As Vietnam bled in aerial combat, Soviet factories continued producing MiG-21s at an industrial pace that astonished Western observers. Between 1959 and 1985, more than 10,645 units rolled off assembly lines, setting an absolute record as the most produced jet combat aircraft in aviation history. This figure exceeded any Western fighter by enormous margins, proving that the Soviet philosophy of simple design and mass production worked exactly as its creators intended. While Americans built sophisticated fighters that cost fortunes and required months of specialized labor, the Soviets flooded the world with MiGs that could be produced quickly and sold to any nation willing to align with Moscow. More than 60 countries across 4 continents operated the MiG-21 at some point in their history, from Afghanistan to Yugoslavia, from Iraq to Finland. Some of these operators no longer exist as nations. East Germany vanished with reunification, Yugoslavia fragmented in bloody wars, and Georgia and Slovakia emerged as independent states after the Soviet collapse. Determining an exact number of operators is difficult precisely because several nations that flew these fighters ceased to exist before the aircraft themselves. This global dispersion turned the MiG-21 into a ubiquitous symbol of the Cold War, present in conflicts from the Middle East to Africa, from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the beginning of an inevitable decline. Factories producing spare parts closed, specialized technicians emigrated or retired, and military budgets evaporated amid the economic chaos that followed the communist collapse. During the 1990s, hundreds of MiG-21s were dismantled and sold as scrap metal. Nations that once operated dozens of these fighters reduced them to small numbers, kept flying with difficulty through cannibalization of other aircraft. By the end of the 20th century, it seemed the fishbed would finally retire permanently to museums and history books. But then something unexpected happened, something that extended the operational life of these veterans beyond any reasonable prediction: the arrival of industrial 3D printing. Countries such as India, which maintained the largest operational MiG-21 fleets, began using additive manufacturing to produce spare parts without relying on Russian suppliers. Components that once required costly, delayed imports could now be manufactured locally in a matter of days. This technological revolution enabled significant electronic upgrades. More sophisticated radars replaced obsolete original systems. Digital communication equipment supplanted old analog radios. New weapon systems were integrated into airframes designed decades earlier. Today, 18 air forces around the world still operate versions of the MiG-21, including regional powers such as India. Remarkably, both Russia and Ukraine maintain examples in active service despite being militarily opposed. Modern versions are radically different machines from the early fishbeds that once terrorized American pilots over Vietnam. They carry next-generation infrared-guided missiles, electronic warfare systems capable of jamming enemy radars, and digital cockpits with multifunction displays. India has announced plans to keep its MiG-21s flying at least until 2025, meaning this design will have remained in active service for nearly 70 years since its first flight. This extraordinary longevity represents both a triumph and a tragedy of aeronautical design. On one hand, it proves Soviet engineers created a fundamentally solid and adaptable platform. On the other, it reveals the economic limitations of many nations that simply cannot afford to replace these veterans with modern fighters costing hundreds of millions per unit. The MiG 21 survives not because it is superior, but because it is good enough and desperately cheap to maintain using contemporary technologies. In the end, the legacy of the MiG-21 remains deeply contradictory. It was the most produced fighter in history, yet it fell into one of the most humiliating traps ever executed. It terrified powerful enemies, yet proved vulnerable when facing intelligent strategies. It flew for dozens of nations, yet many abandoned it as soon as they could afford something better. It continues to fly after nearly 7 decades, but mainly because its operators lack economically viable alternatives. It is a machine that defined an era of military aviation while simultaneously exposing the limits of relying solely on numbers and simplicity against adversaries capable of creative thinking. If you found this story fascinating, help me by pressing the like button and leave a comment telling me which other combat aircraft you'd like to explore in future videos. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories about the machines that shaped the conflicts of the 20th century. See you on the next flight through the history of military aviation.